Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Indigenous Borderlands, Native Agency, Resilience, and Power in the Americas. Edited by Joaquín, Rivaya-Martínez. Narrated by Kaipo Schwab. Publisher's note: this audiobook contains references to visuals present in the print and ebook editions of the book. Introduction. Problematizing Indigenous Borderlands. Joaquín Rivaya-Martínez. The romantic masterpiece, La Vuelta del Malón, The Return of the Indian Raid, represents an indigenous raiding party returning victorious with its loot, presumably in the Pampa region of 19th century Argentina. Its author, Ángel de la Valle, painted it for the World's Columbian Exposition, held in Chicago in 1893 to commemorate the 4th centenary of Columbus's first arrival in the Western Hemisphere. There the painting obtained a medal, evocative of the pretended confrontation between indigenous barbarism and European civilization. The canvas has often been interpreted as legitimizing the infamous Desert Campaign of 1879, which brought an end to native resistance in southern Argentina. It certainly resonates with some of the themes that have been the staple of Euro-American expansionist propaganda along many frontiers: native fierceness and heathenism, the plundering of settlements, the desecration of sacred objects, the theft of livestock, and the kidnapping of Christian women. Intentionally or not, however, the painting admits an alternative reading. The white female captive and the Christian ritual objects carried by the raiders symbolize indigenous power and dominance. The natives ride horses and carry iron-tipped lances, evincing the incorporation of European-introduced species and objects into Amerindian cultures. The raiders are spread all over the landscape in a way that suggests symbiosis with and occupation of the land. Implicitly, this work of art thus conveys indigenous agency, adaptiveness, resilience, sovereignty, and power, all key themes in this book. Recent scholarship on the Americas has dispelled once pervasive myths of European domination and indigenous submission and disappearance, showing instead that, despite the initial upheavals caused by the European intrusion, Amerindians often thrived after contact. It is now widely accepted in academic circles that European expansion depended fundamentally on the participation of Indian allies, that the immediate and long-term outcomes of initial encounters were neither predictable nor unavoidable. Instead, often those outcomes hinged on native understandings and actions. Building on that scholarship, this book explores the manifold ways in which Amerindians adapted to the intrusion of people of European descent to preserve their sovereignty, their land, and their culture, thus shaping indigenous borderlands across the Americas. Covering a wide chronological and geographical span from the 16th century U.S. South to 20th century Bolivia, this volume expands our knowledge in innovative ways, challenging conventional wisdom about what supposedly happened to native peoples across the Western Hemisphere after contact, and pointing out alternative approaches and potential avenues for further research. Often drawing on previously untapped or underutilized primary sources, the contributors to this book manifest the incompleteness of imperial and state conquests, the resilience and relative success of indigenous communities decades or even centuries after they are commonly and wrongly thought to have been subordinated to non-natives, made dependent on colonial forces, or even vanished, and the rhetorical creation of imagined borderlands through the discursive construction of indigenous others. They also underscore the persistence of internal indigenous borderlands within territories claimed by Europeans or Euro-Americans, implicitly challenging the traditional dichotomy between center and periphery that underlies much borderlands scholarship. Indigenous Borderlands, a working definition. The meaning of borderlands, once restrictively applied in U.S. historiography as a synonym for the Spanish, then Mexican frontiers in North America, has expanded considerably in the last decades, becoming a pervasive catch-all expression in English-language scholarship. Hence, it is pertinent to clarify up front what we mean by it. A borderland can be defined simply as any territory near a border, characterized by a set of topographic, environmental, and socio-demographic features. The notion of borderland that we espouse, however, has both material and non-material components. A borderland is a geographic or ideological space, frequently both, of vague contours, where discrete and ethnically diverse human populations meet and interact, where cross-cultural influences and exchanges, both physical and intellectual, are relatively frequent and consequential, and over which no polity or community can de facto exercise full jurisdiction or domination. It is precisely the fluidity of the interethnic relationships and the lack of political and cultural control that confer upon a borderland its distinct nature, setting it apart from other spaces. Contrary to some definitions advanced by other scholars, our notion of borderland does not presume the existence of a state, empire, or marked border. Like Dana Levine-Rojo and Cynthia Radding, we consider borderlands as lived spaces rather than boundaries. Such spaces may exist within or beyond states and empires. Similarly, Indigenous Borderlands has both geopolitical and socio-cultural connotations. The expression refers to those borderlands within and beyond colonial frontiers and state boundaries, where indigenous groups interacted in significant ways with one another, with non-natives, or with both, prior to the displacement, extermination, or incorporation of the natives into modern states. In indigenous borderlands, independent or semi-autonomous native peoples exerted considerable power, often retaining control of the land and remaining paramount agents of historical transformation after the European intrusion. Conversely, European conquests and colonization were typically slow and incomplete, as the newcomers, often operating in a climate of mistrust and violence that hindered peaceful coexistence, struggled to assert their authority and implement policies designed to subjugate Aboriginal societies and change native beliefs and practices. In indigenous borderlands, people, plants, animals, pathogens, technologies, and ideas moved across ethnic boundaries that blurred often as cultural traditions intertwined and merged. Yet, numerous indigenous groups in the Americas and around the world remain culturally distinct and politically autonomous, or at least partially unincorporated to this day. Thus, although the essays in this book focus on the period prior to 1920, Indigenous Borderlands is still a valid category for studying the modern world. Recent years have witnessed growing academic interest in urban Indians, that is, natives who resided, often in separate enclaves in metropolitan settings, where they sometimes interacted extensively with non-natives. Indeed, much of the most influential literature on Amerindians produced in the last decades deals with indigenous communities established according to colonial models under European auspices and domination, albeit often in ways that partially conformed to Aboriginal practices and expectations. Such developments typically occurred in regions that cannot be easily classified as borderlands or that did not maintain a borderland configuration for very long. Conversely, we cast Amerindians as pivotal historical agents in long-lasting borderlands defined by the presence of independent or semi-autonomous indigenous peoples. Even though the essays in this book focus on the period after 1492, it is important to remember that the history of the Western Hemisphere began several millennia earlier, with the arrival of the first human populations from Asia. The last few centuries are just the terminal period of a much deeper and richer history that archaeologists across the Americas are still unearthing. Indeed, the existence of borderlands in the Western Hemisphere predates the arrival of Europeans. By 1492, the Americas had long been the scene of migrations, conquests, mergers of peoples, and the rise and spread of countless beliefs and practices as cultures, polities, and borderlands formed, evolved, coalesced, and disappeared over time. This dynamism gave rise to the enormous ethnic and linguistic diversity and the complex political mosaic that Europeans encountered. In fact, the nature of pre-contact borderlands and intergroup relations fundamentally conditioned the speed and thoroughness of European conquests and colonization. Organization of this book. The book is organized into 4 parts and an epilogue. Part 1, Multidisciplinary Approaches, consists of 3 chapters. In Chapter 1, I provide a state-of-the-field survey of the historiography, identify some under-researched areas, and discuss the benefits of interdisciplinary approaches, thus introducing a central idea of this volume, that historians can partially compensate for the lack of Amerindian written records by studying archival documents in combination with non-written evidence to reconstruct indigenous perspectives and experiences. Such a strategy requires borrowing concepts, research questions, and methodologies from archaeology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, geography, ecology, and other disciplines. As Cynthia Radding demonstrates in Chapter 2, reading archival sources in light of non-textual evidence permits scholars to reconstruct and interpret the entwined processes of colonial encounter and cultural recreation in indigenous borderlands. She discusses the historical construction of cultural landscapes in Ostimuri, a province of northwestern New Spain, bounded by the Yaqui, Mayo, and Fuerte rivers. Radding reads a variety of sources and dialogue with selected archaeological, ecological, and ethnographic themes to explore the formation of that region as a series of cultural spaces evolving through time. This multidisciplinary approach permits her to bring to light the secular resilience of the Yoreme and neighboring native peoples despite their apparent vulnerabilities when confronted with the exigencies of colonialism. Canadian historical geographer Geoffrey Wallace demonstrates in Chapter 3 the usefulness of Geographic Information System, GIS technology, in reassessing the indigenous past. Through examining GIS-generated maps in light of environmental data and quantitative analyses of Spanish documents, Wallace unveils the relevance of the beeswax industry in the 17th century Yucatec Maya borderlands, and discerns the critical roles Mayas played in the production and trade of that coveted commodity. Wallace painstakingly reconstructs the overland trade routes that connected Yucatec towns in the outer edges of the Spanish province of Yucatan to Yucatec refugee settlements and independent Maya polities in the peninsula's southeast. Beginning in the late 16th century, large quantities of beeswax flowed along those Maya networks toward the Spanish colony in exchange for salt, metal tools, and other goods. The proliferation of bees in the central and southern Maya lowlands, and the ease and reliability with which the wax could be bartered, afforded independent Mayas both a livelihood and considerable political clout, enticing Maya refugees to flee the province. Paradoxically, beeswax extraction and trade made Yucatan Spaniards dependent on fugitive communities for one of the province's key exports at the same time as they sought to eradicate independent Maya communities and curb the flow of refugees out of the colony. Part 2, Indigenous Power and Charismatic Leadership, consists of 2 chapters that reassess power relations in 2 well-studied indigenous borderlands by situating the focus squarely on the natives and highlighting the political power and diplomatic acumen of 2 little-known yet very influential indigenous leaders. In Chapter 4, the anthropologist Robbie Etheridge examines documentary and archaeological evidence in unison to reveal the deeply rooted indigenous social, political, and cultural norms that shaped native responses to the Spanish intrusion into the Mississippian borderlands of today's U.S. South in the 1540s. Etheridge cogently proposes to parse Hernando de Soto's Entrada for its numerous encounters with discrete native polities, instead of conceptualizing the whole expedition as a single episode. She discusses De Soto's encounter with Chief Tuscaloosa, Grand Cacique Chief of the paramount chiefdom of Tuscaloosa in present-day central Alabama. Spaniards described Tuscaloosa as a giant of a man, and Etheridge's analysis corroborates the physical and political stature of this native leader whose military might and political acumen enabled him to manipulate and resist the Spanish. In Chapter 5, Mexican scholars Cuauhtemoc Velasco Avila and Antonio Cruz Zarate discuss a series of diplomatic contacts between Juan de Ugalde, commander-in-chief of the eastern internal provinces of New Spain, and the little-known Llanero, also Lipian Apaches, between 1787 and 1789. Drawing partly on untapped sources, Velasco and Cruz shed light on the identity of the Llaneros, their culture, customs, and political organization, and the preeminence of their main leader, Picazande Instintle. Their analyses reveal that in the last decades of the 18th century, Spaniards recognized the Llaneros as a powerful indigenous group capable of preserving their independence from the Spanish while confronting the expanding Comanches. Llaneros ranged over a vast territory centered between the Pecos River in New Mexico and the Colorado River of Texas. Picazande's military and religious ascendancy extended to the Lipan and Mescalero Apaches. Llanero influence spread thus over an enormous territory on both sides of the Rio Grande. Part 3. Imagined Borderlands, Colonial Discourses and Indigenous Realities, explores different ways in which uncritical acceptance of colonial sources may blur scholars' comprehension of indigenous realities and lead to unwarranted interpretations. In Chapter 6, French historian Chantal Cramausel discusses the historical contexts and the criteria that Spaniards followed to designate native groups from the Bolson de Mapimi, a vast region of present-day north-central Mexico that remained in internal indigenous borderland after the colonial period. She cautioned scholars against credulously reproducing the Spanish system of designations. Even though Spaniards sometimes adopted indigenous terms to label native groups, the main purpose of the terminology they used, Cramausel argues, was to show the Indians' place within colonial society, classifying them as friends, enemies, mission, encomienda, hacienda Indians, and so on. Hence, the common assumption that Spanish designations for indigenous groups refer only to their territory or ethnicity is misleading. Another potential problem derived from historians' unquestioning reliance on Euro-American sources is the risk of perpetuating cultural misunderstandings, fabrications, and discursive fictions. In Chapter 7, Paul Conrad compares Spanish documents from 18th century Nueva Vizcaya and Cuba, arguing that the suspected presence of indigenous people deemed dangerous to colonial society exercised a historical influence that outsized their actual demographic or military power. In both regions, the presence of Apaches, real or imagined, took on a discursive life of its own. In Nueva Vizcaya, Apaches were singled out as perpetrators of numerous crimes, even though investigations suggested the participation of various individuals of diverse ethnic heritage. Anxieties about the allegiance of Mission Indians and other Spanish subjects, and about their sympathies for Indios Barbaros, independent, unaccultured Indians, compelled colonial authorities to wage war on Apaches and deport those captured as far away as Cuba, where similar apprehensions eventually emerged. After some of the prisoners fled to the island's countryside, killings and depredations began to be blamed on Indian fugitives and runaway African slaves, despite scarce and inconclusive evidence. Thus, the Apache borderlands of Nueva Vizcaya and Cuba were, at least in part, a discursive construct. As Conrad concludes, historians need to be aware that the perceived threats posed by indigenous people to colonial society did not have to be proven to be consequential to Spanish policy. Euro-American sources may also be deceiving in other ways. In Chapter 8, Argentinian historian Guillermo Wild cautions against accepting official colonial narratives at face value, as they tend to obscure indigenous logics and realities. Beginning in the late 18th century, amidst the renewed Spanish and Portuguese impetus to colonize the fringes of their South American dominions and control the peoples there, officials, travelers, and jurists endeavored to refine classifications, descriptions, measurements, and cartographic representations, and to establish boundaries. In the Guarani borderlands of today's Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina, colonial agents attempted to assimilate native populations into colonial society through homogenizing practices and formal discourses, progressively circumscribing indigenous territories as a continuous space distributed among ethnic nations or imperial domains. As Wild shows, however, indigenous territorial logics structured in dynamic networks of families and cacicazgos, chiefdoms, betray the porousness of those supposed ethnic and imperial boundaries. Indeed, some of the kinship networks and cacicazgos persisted even after the dissolution of the pueblos de misión, mission villages, and the fall of the Iberian empires. Colonial authorities often claimed domination in regions where a careful scrutiny of the documents reveals native agency and autonomy. That is the overarching theme of Part 4, Indigenous Sovereignty in Unexpected Places, which consists of 3 chapters. Despite the disproportionate historiographic emphasis on imperial frontiers that tend to be seen as outlying and marginal from a Eurocentric colonial perspective, stories of native survival, resistance, and domination also abound at the heart of territories claimed by European empires and American republics, what we refer to as internal indigenous borderlands. Like the aforementioned Bolsón de Mapimí, the Jujuy region of today's northwestern Argentina provides a case in point. As Enrique Normando Cruz, a native of the area, explains in Chapter 9, the jurisdiction of Jujuy, a city founded by the Spanish in 1593 in the district of Tucumán, became an internal borderland and remained so until the first decades of the 19th century. The Indians in the region successfully resorted to a variety of strategies to resist foreign domination and ultimately incorporate themselves into the colonial system on their own terms. The ability of indigenous peoples under the nominal jurisdiction of foreign polities to retain their land in the face of external encroachment is the subject of the other 2 chapters in this section. In Chapter 10, Gary Van Valen examines the oft-successful efforts of Pueblo Indians and Genizados, Hispanized descendants of ransomed Indians, to resist spoliation in late Spanish and early Mexican New Mexico. Between 1815 and 1825, members of the Hispanic elite, drawing partly on new liberal theories of private land ownership, advanced at the Cortes of Cadiz, implemented various strategies to privatize communal and common land at the expense of people of indigenous descent. Pueblos and Genizados actively resisted those land acquisitions and usurpations. Thus, the initially successful attempts at privatizing public land on the New Mexican frontier came to a halt in 1825. In Chapter 11, Eric Langer challenges the widespread idea that frontier land grants in Latin American republics favored only settlers of European descent to the detriment of indigenous people. Examining land grant records and documents kept by landlords, Langer shows that the Chiriguano and Chane Indians from the lowlands of southeastern Bolivia managed to use the land grant process, meant to take away Indian land, to preserve some of their communities. Chiriguanos succeeded in this endeavor through alliances with powerful Euro-American landlords and local authorities whom they provided with indigenous labor. Where agricultural labor was needed and scarce, landlords had an interest in maintaining the territorial integrity of the indigenous communities for their own benefit, and Chiriguanos took full advantage of the situation. The epilogue reflects briefly on some of the challenges that Native communities still face: social and political discrimination, usurpation of land and resources, cultural loss, and other infringements of individual and communal rights continue to afflict many indigenous peoples across the Americas. In every instance, though, natives remain active in defense of their lands, their rights, their autonomy, and their culture. Part 1. Multidisciplinary Approaches. Chapter 1. Indigenous Borderlands, State of the Field and Prospects. Joaquín Rivaya-Martínez. Indigenous peoples have played crucial roles in the history of the Western Hemisphere ever since the earliest human populations colonized it more than 15,000 years ago. Beginning in the 1490s, the Aboriginal peoples of the Americas endured military conquest, enslavement, coerced labor, cultural deprivation, land encroachment, and many other forms of colonial oppression, frequently during or in the wake of extremely deadly epidemics of diseases imported from the Old World that caused tremendous population declines. Europeans and their descendants wreaked such havoc on indigenous peoples that their actions have often been branded as ethnocide, ethnic cleansing, or genocide. Irrespective of what labels we choose, as James Merrill and Colin Calloway have argued, after 1492, the Western Hemisphere truly became a new world for all, natives included. Far from being passive victims, though, Amerindians implemented a myriad of strategies to cope with the formidable challenges the newcomers brought about, giving rise to indigenous borderlands throughout the hemisphere. Indeed, despite the ambitious territorial claims of European empires and the independent republics that succeeded them, indigenous peoples often remained autonomous and retained control over vast expanses of the Western Hemisphere long after their initial contact with Europeans. These statements, now widely accepted among specialists, stand in stark contrast with the Eurocentric views forged and perpetuated by generations of scholarly assumptions and misinterpretations, some of which are still common among the general public. In this chapter, I offer a panoramic overview of the historiography and propose ethno-historical perspectives, and interdisciplinary approaches as the most promising avenues to expand our knowledge about.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?